CBSE Board History, Chapter 8, Part 7, Audio by Renee Matthew. We saw in the previous audios how society reformed. There was a longing and yearning for the society to reform and change. It's not just the clothing. When there was a revolution in the clothing and the patterns of dressing style, obviously society was also undergoing a lot of transformation. There were a lot of changes which the people went through, and gradually clothes also changed, purchase of materials, the way people dressed up, the outlook on the society, everything changed. Conservatives also gradually changed their ideals. So, as the history of clothing is linked to the larger history of society, we can say that it is interdependent. One part will not change without changing the other part. It is like they coexist. We can't say that only the evolution of clothing took place and nothing else changed in the society. Definitely, everything is interdependent and everything changed at a drastic level. We saw how clothing was defined by dominant cultural attitudes and ideals of beauty, and how these notions changed over time. These two phrases are very important. Dominant cultural attitudes means it was created by the society. Definitely, people who were richer were dominant in the society. They imposed laws, and the king or the monarch was always favoring them. The poor always stayed or remained poorer. So the dominant cultural attitudes started growing. Like everybody dressed the same, but still the attitude was still there. We saw that the women from the upper classes mixed with the women from the lower class, but still, even though they mixed, they did not stop their attitude. Clothing was similar and people just looked the same, but it doesn't mean that there was a stop to the attitude. And ideals of beauty really changed. No longer women was expected to be docile, subservient, and to surrender to everything that is being told to them. There was dominant and prominent change in the ideals of womanhood. We saw how reformers and conservatives struggled to shape these ideals. So everybody struggled because the ridicule was persistent. Nothing stopped. Even when the conservatives saw that these changes were bringing some kind of benefit to the society, still people ridiculed. And that is part of the society. It is nature of the society. Even now it is like that. And how changes within technology and economy and the pressures of new times made people feel the need for change. So until and unless people felt the need for change, the conservatives did not oblige to the change. They were not supporting the cause of the change because they never felt the need for the change. So now the people really felt the need for change because of the discomfort zones, not only in the clothing, but also in the way they carried, in the way they moved, and the way they interacted with each other. So this heading, as you see here, transformation in colonial India. So we saw how things changed over time in other parts of the world. So what was India doing at this time? Because most parts of the world was dominated and colonized by the Europeans. So what was happening in India? And definitely India was a part of the imperialism, and it was a prey for the Europeans because of its rich culture, because of its richness and everything, the heritage. So we know the history of India, how it was looted. But during this transformation, what was really happening in India is the question. During the colonial period, there were significant changes in male and female clothing in India. So, of course, India was not spared, because we saw in the previous audio that when the Europeans colonized the other parts of the world, automatically the local people also got influenced. It's not just the speaking, but also they started to think like the English, walk like the English, and talk like the English. If you were not ready for that, they taught you how to do it. So that is what happened in India. So let's see how the clothing was affected or influenced in India. So there are 2 points that is being highlighted here: Western dress forms and missionary activity. This is something which influenced the clothing in India. Missionary activity was very prominent. People from the western parts of the country wanted to promote Christianity. And when the missionaries came to the country, of course, they had their style of dressing and they did a lot of preaching. So when they had to preach, definitely the locals also were expected to respond to these missionaries. And of course, what was their mission? It was to only promote Christianity. So for their convenience, things changed gradually. What is the next point? Efforts by Indians to fashion clothing styles that embodied an indigenous tradition and culture. So, one part of the country or one part of the local people was really happy. They wanted to change their clothing style, the way they talked, and they started imitating the Westerners. But there was another half of the country who really fell for the traditional style of clothing that we have, the culture, and they wanted to maintain the culture. At the same time, they wanted to ape or imitate the Western style. So, what will happen? There will be a fusion. Both Western and Eastern style is mixed, and the clothing also becomes a fusion style of pattern. That kind of pattern was followed in their clothing style. So, missionary people also tried to influence, and some people fell into it, and they really wanted to change for the better. There was another part of the country who really did not support, and they were for the embroidery work, the cultural style, the pattern that Indians always had in mind. So they were for such kind of thing. So cloth and clothing, in fact, became very important symbols of the national movement. So, you know how Mahatma Gandhi promoted the Khadi movement and all these things. So, cloth and clothing, it was a very important part of our national struggle against the foreigners. And we will see how it developed or how it played a prominent part in the national struggle and also in the national movement. So, these 2 parts of the country is highlighted in this slide. How one half of the country was for it and the other half of the country was partially for it, not completely. So, what was the reaction of the Indians? That is very important. Indians reacted in 3 different ways. When Western style clothing came into India in the 19th century, so in the beginning of the chapter itself, we see that they have asked us to pay attention to the 19th and the 20th century because that is when rapid change took place. Till then, people were trying their best. It is not that no changes took place in the earlier centuries, but these 2 centuries had a historic transformation which was really notable. It was taking place at a very fast pace. So, the first response or the first group of people, how did they respond? Many, especially men, began incorporating some elements of Western style clothing in their dress. So, men were really fascinated and they were readily accepting the Western culture which was brought in by the missionaries and the other traders. So, we will start with the Parsis. The wealthy Parsis of Western India, so wealthy Parsis who are really having financial support and who is well off, only those people in western part of India were among the first to adapt Western style clothing. This is a very important point. The Parsis followed it first, and that too from the western part of the country. So, what did they do? How did they change. I told you that everybody was not for the style because, of course, they were shy to immediately change the style of dressing and everything. So, what did they do? They incorporated both the Western and the Indian style, and they had a fusion kind of dress. Like, even now, we have got this fusion pattern dressing, which is very prominent in vogue, and people are really following this in fashion. So, what was their pattern? Baggy trousers and the penta or hat were added to long collarless coats with boots and a walking stick to complete the look of the gentleman. So, even when you read world history, we can see that the idea of gentleman is very important and significant in both literature, sociology, political science, everywhere. So, even in history. So, in India, walking stick was very important. That is one thing that really caught attention. Baggy trousers. Trousers were no longer tight fitting or correct fitting. It was baggy, and there was a hat which was shaped in a particular way. It was added to long, collarless coats. It's not the ordinary coat that you have, but without collar, collarless coats. So, to some, Western clothes were a sign of modernity and progress. So, some people really felt that if we try to imitate, if we are successful in following the Western culture, the style of dressing, it is a great sign of modernity and progress. And if you don't follow what they are trying to teach us, it is not a sign of modernity and progress. So, this was what fascinated them, and Western clothing really influenced them to keep a track of how they progressed and how they were floating into the modern era. So, that was the kind of notion that the Parsis from the western part of the country had. So you can take a look at the picture which is shown on the screen. So I have taken two pictures from two different times. One figure is already given in your textbook. That is the one on the left hand side. The one on the right hand side is totally different, but both of them have got the same patterns of dressing. The hat, look at the hat. The hat is shaped in a different way, right? It is slanted and it is a different material that they have used. And it is not exactly coat that they are wearing, something like a kurta that you have got now. It is collarless coats. No collar is there. It is like something like the shirt collar that we have now for the school. Some of the schools and kurtas have got these kind of styles. And it is really long, and you can't call it fitting or tight fitted trousers. Earlier in the European parts of the country, the western parts of the globe, we can see that the gentlemen wore knee breeches. Do you remember that diagram where the trousers were really tight? It was fitting to the legs. But here it is not like that. It is loose, it is baggy. Maybe it is for the comfort, but we can see that there is a total fusion here. And can you see all the men carrying walking sticks? And of course, they started behaving like gentlemen. So without the hat, they will not go out. Without this attire, they will not go out. And they were really fascinated by the way the kurta was designed and the baggy trousers were patterned with the shoes. Some of them wore shoes, but boots were really famous with the walking stick. Why? To give them the look of a gentleman. And that was the main purpose of it.